Chapter 1: The Last Ferry. The engine of the sea serpent churned a wake of greasy, brown foam in the gray water of the Sound. It was the only vessel moving in either direction. Mark Copeland stood at the bow, a stiff sea wind whipping his light jacket against his chest, but he did not seem to notice the cold. His face, usually creased with the mild stress of grading papers, was open with a boyish enthusiasm. He aimed a cheap pair of binoculars towards the hazy smudge on the horizon. "Can you see it yet, Leo?" he asked, lowering the binoculars. "The jewel of the New England coast." His son, Leo, 9 years old and bundled in a bright yellow raincoat far too large for him, stood on his toes to peer over the salt-crusted railing. He shook his head, his dark hair plastered to his forehead by the spray. "It's just fog, Dad." "Ah, but it's historic fog," Mark said with a grin. "Imagine this is the same view the whalers had for 300 years. No GPS, no sonar, just a compass and a prayer." From her position near the ferry's small, enclosed cabin, Sarah Copeland watched her husband. She hugged her arms around herself, a gesture less about the cold and more about a persistent, unplaceable anxiety. The trip had been Mark's idea from start to finish. He found the article in a dusty travel magazine, Port Blossom, a perfectly preserved step back in time. He'd been captivated by the promise of a town with no chain stores, no traffic lights, a place where history was not in a museum but in the very cobblestones under your feet. A digital detox, he'd called it, a real family vacation. Sarah had agreed because it made him happy. But the moment they left the mainland, a quiet dread began to settle in her stomach. The water was too still, the sky a uniform, oppressive sheet of gray. Even the gulls that had followed them from the dock had peeled away miles ago, leaving them utterly alone on the slate-colored sea. "Is there even Wi-Fi?" The voice was flat, dripping with teenage apathy. Paige, their 16-year-old, leaned against the cabin wall, her thumbs moving over the screen of a phone that had lost its signal 20 minutes prior. "Because if I can't upload my pics of this historic fog, I might actually die of boredom." "There's a town-wide network. Spotty, but it's there," Mark answered, his optimism unassailable. "Mayor March said so in his email. It's part of the authentic experience." "Spotty Wi-Fi is not an authentic experience. It's a human rights violation," Paige muttered. Sarah walked over and put a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Try to enjoy it. A week away from all that." She gestured vaguely with her hand. "Away from what? Civilization," Paige shot back, though without any real venom. She slid the phone into her pocket. "Fine, I'll go commune with the sea gulls. Oh, wait." The ferry gave a low groan as its engine pitch changed. A lone figure emerged from the pilot's cabin, a man whose age was impossible to guess. He was weathered like a piece of driftwood, his skin a network of deep lines, his hands chapped and thick. He moved to the bow and began to uncoil a heavy, thick rope without a single word or a glance in their direction. He was the ferryman, and he had not spoken since they'd boarded. He had simply taken Mark's cash payment for the round trip, his eyes fixed on some point over Mark's shoulder, and gestured them aboard with a flick of his chin. The fog on the horizon began to thin, not dissipating but pulling apart like gray cotton to reveal the silhouette of Port Blossom, It looked exactly like the pictures in the magazine. A single, sharp church steeple rose above a cluster of salt-box houses and steep gabled roofs that huddled around a deep, natural harbor. A long stone pier jutted out into the water, and at its end, a crooked lighthouse stood sentinel. It was picturesque. It was perfect. And every instinct in Sarah's body screamed that it was wrong. "There she is," Mark breathed, his voice full of reverence. He lifted Leo so the boy could see better. "What do you think, champ?" Leo squinted. "The lighthouse looks sleepy." Mark chuckled. "Sleepy, how so?" "It's leaning," the boy said matter-of-factly. He was right. The lighthouse, a tower of gray stone and peeling white paint, listed slightly to one side, like a tired old man stooping against the wind. It gave the whole island a subtly off-kilter appearance. As the sea serpent drew closer, other details sharpened. The buildings were not just old, they were saturated with age, the wood of their walls stained nearly black by centuries of salt and spray. Strange, intricate carvings decorated the gables and door frames, depicting swirling waves, coiling tentacles, and wide-mouthed fish that seemed to be screaming. And the smell. The air, which should have been clean and briny, was thick with a strange undertone. It was the scent of the sea, yes, but layered with something else. Something heavy and organic, like low tide mixed with a butcher's shop. A small crowd of people had gathered on the dock to greet the ferry. They were all smiling. It should have been a welcoming sight, but their smiles were too wide, too uniform. They stood in a neat line, their hands clasped before them, a reception committee for a town that supposedly saw few visitors. The ferryman threw the heavy rope with an expert flick of his wrist. A man on the dock caught it and looped it around a thick, dark post. The wood of the post was covered in the same carvings as the houses, worn smooth by time and countless ropes. The ferry bumped against the pier with a sound like a muffled drumbeat. The ferryman lowered a wooden gangplank, the motion practiced and efficient. He still had not made eye contact. At the front of the welcoming party stood a man in his late 60s, dressed in navy slacks, a thick cable-knit sweater, and a captain's hat that sat on his head of voluminous white hair at a jaunty angle. His face was a cheerful, ruddy pink, and his smile was the widest of all. "The Copelands," he boomed, his voice full of warmth and authority. He strode forward, his hand outstretched. "Welcome, welcome. I'm Obadiah March, the mayor. We are so delighted to have you." Mark, beaming, stepped onto the dock and shook the mayor's hand with vigor. "A pleasure to meet you, Mayor. I'm Mark. This is my wife, Sarah, our daughter, Paige, and our son, Leo." Mayor March shook each of their hands, his grip surprisingly strong, his skin cool and dry. When he took Sarah's hand, his smile faltered for a fraction of a second as his eyes met hers. It was a flicker of something cold and appraising, an expression so at odds with his jovial demeanor that she flinched. Then it was gone, replaced by the beaming mask. "A beautiful family," he declared. "Just the sort of new blood, forgive the turn of phrase, our town needs to appreciate its unique charms. You'll be staying at the Siren's Rest Inn, I presume. Beatrice has been preparing for you all day." He gestured to an elderly woman standing beside him. She was plump and grandmotherly, with kind, crinkling eyes and a floral apron over her dress. "That's me," she said, her voice soft and sweet as honey. "Beatrice Stowe, so good to have you. I've got cider warming on the stove and fresh molasses cookies for the little ones." Paige managed a weak, polite smile. Leo, however, was still staring at the water, his attention captured by the dark, swirling eddies around the pier posts. "Well, grab your bags and come along," Mayor March said, clapping Mark on the shoulder. "Let us get you settled in. The Founding Day Festival begins tomorrow. You've arrived at the most wonderful time of the year." As the family retrieved their luggage, Sarah glanced back at the ferry. The ferryman was already pulling up the gangplank. He did not seem to be preparing for a return journey. He was simply securing the boat to the dock, his movements final and absolute. The engine of the Sea Serpent sputtered and died, plunging the harbor into an abrupt, profound silence, broken only by the rhythmic lapping of water against the wood. The line of smiling townsfolk had not moved. They were all watching, their heads tilted at a nearly identical angle. The Siren's Rest Inn was a three-story building of dark timber and leaded glass windows that overlooked the town square. A large, beautifully carved sign of a mermaid hung above the door. On closer inspection, the mermaid's face was contorted in a silent scream. Inside, the inn was cozy and impeccably clean. The air smelled of cinnamon, old wood, and something else, the same faint, coppery scent from the docks. Beatrice Stowe checked them in at a heavy wooden desk, her movements full of practiced hospitality. "You'll have the family suite top floor, the best view of the harbor," she said, handing Mark a heavy brass key. "Dinner is at 7. We're having the town specialty, blossom stew. You're in for a treat." "We can't wait," Mark said, already captivated by the historical artifacts that lined the walls. Harpoons, sextants, and framed, yellowing maps of the coastline. They lugged their suitcases up 2 flights of winding stairs. The suite was spacious, with 2 bedrooms and a small sitting area. The furniture was all heavy, dark, and antique. The windows did indeed offer a panoramic view of the harbor, where the Sea Serpent now sat motionless, a ghost ship in the fading light. "Well, this is rustic," Paige commented, dropping her backpack onto a quilt-covered bed. She immediately pulled out her phone. "And 0 bars, the town-wide network must be a myth." "Give it time," Mark said, unzipping his suitcase. "We're here to disconnect, remember." While her parents and sister were preoccupied, Leo slipped out of the room and back down the stairs. He was drawn by a sound only he seemed to hear, a faint, rhythmic clicking. He followed it out the inn's back door and into a small, cobbled yard that ended at a low sea wall. The clicking was louder here. It came from the shore below. He clambered down a short, slippery set of stone steps to the beach. It was not a sandy beach, but one made of smooth, dark gray stones and pebbles. The clicking came from hundreds of crabs, larger than any he had ever seen, that were scuttling across the stones. Their claws clicked and clacked against the pebbles, an eerie, insectal chorus. Leo walked along the water's edge, the waves sighing as they lapped at the shore. He was looking for shells. Most were ordinary, broken fragments of mussels and clams. But then he saw it. Lying half buried in the wet gravel was a shell unlike any other. It was a perfect spiral, the size of his fist, and its surface shimmered with an oily, rainbow luminescence that seemed to shift and writhe in the dim light. The geometry of it was hypnotic, the spiral tightening into a perfect dark point at its center. He picked it up. The shell was strangely warm, humming with a low, almost imperceptible vibration. Curious, he did what any child would do. He lifted it to his ear. He expected to hear the ocean. He did not. What he heard was a whisper. It was not a human voice. It was a wet, sibilant sound, like water being forced through a narrow crack deep underground. It spoke no words he understood, but the cadence was conversational, questioning. It was a voice that had been waiting a very, very long time to be heard. Leo stood frozen on the desolate beach, the giant crabs chattering around his feet, the sky darkening to a deep, starless purple overhead. He did not feel afraid. He felt chosen. Up in the family suite, Sarah was unpacking her toiletries when she looked out the window. She saw her son standing on the beach below, unnaturally still. She was about to call down to him when she noticed something else. Out in the harbor near the far sea wall, a series of bubbles broke the surface of the placid water. They were not fish. The disturbance was too large. A dark shape moved beneath the water, something long and sinuous. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. She shivered, a deep primal chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. She turned from the window. The room was quiet. The old inn was quiet. The whole town seemed to be holding its breath. And from somewhere downstairs she could hear the gentle, rhythmic chop of a kitchen knife as Beatrice Stowe began to prepare the blossom stew. Mark entered the bedroom from the sitting area. "Everything okay?" he asked, seeing her expression. "Fine," Sarah lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired from the trip." "Nothing a good meal can't fix," he said, wrapping an arm around her. "Come on, let's go see what a 300-year-old recipe tastes like." He led her from the room, his mind full of history and adventure. Sarah followed, but she could not shake the image of the shape in the water or the sight of her son, standing alone on the shore as the tide began to creep in. She could not shake the feeling that they were not on vacation. They were in a display case, and something on the other side of the glass was looking in. Chapter 2: The Scrimshaw Prophecies. Morning in Port Blossom arrived not with sunlight, but with a thickening of the ever-present fog. It rolled in from the sea, a silent white tide that muffled all sound and reduced the world to a few dozen feet in any direction. It clung to the dark wood of the houses and dripped from the needle-sharp steeple of the silent Sparrow Church. The town, which had seemed quaintly historic the day before, now appeared skeletal and ancient, a relic exhumed from a forgotten grave. The Copelands were the only guests in the Siren's Rest Inn's dining room. Breakfast was a lavish affair. Scrambled eggs, thick-cut bacon, blueberry pancakes, and coffee strong enough to dissolve a spoon. Beatrice Stowe bustled around them, refilling mugs and offering more food with a relentless, cloying sweetness. "You must eat up," she insisted, her smile never wavering. "Big day today, the first day of the Founding Day Festival. You wouldn't want to miss the opening ceremony in the square." Mark, a map of the town spread next to his plate, was in heaven. "I was just reading about that. It says here the ceremony honors Captain Hezekiah March, who founded the town in 1678 after his whaling ship, the Providence, was miraculously saved from a storm." "That's the one," Beatrice chirped. Hezekiah made a promise that day, that if his crew were spared, he and his descendants would show their gratitude to the sea for all time, and we are a town that keeps its promises. Her eyes twinkled as she said it, but the expression held no warmth. Sarah pushed a piece of pancake around her plate. The blossom stew from the previous night had been thick and briny, with a strange, sweet aftertaste she could not identify. It had sat in her stomach like a stone, and her sleep had been plagued by dreams of crushing pressure and fathomless black water. She had woken with a gasp, the sensation of drowning still clinging to her. "Leo, eat your breakfast," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. Her son was not eating. He was staring out the foggy window, his hand resting on his jacket pocket, where a noticeable bulge showed the outline of the strange shell he had found. "I'm not hungry," he mumbled, his eyes distant. "Did you sleep well, dear?" Beatrice asked him, her head tilted. Leo turned from the window. His gaze was unnervingly direct. "My friend told me stories." Beatrice's smile widened, a subtle, knowing crinkle at the corners of her eyes. "Oh, and what did your friend have to say?" "He said he's hungry too," Leo replied, his voice a flat monotone. An awkward silence fell over the table. Mark cleared his throat. "Kids and their imaginary friends, eh?" he said with a forced laugh. Beatrice simply patted Leo's shoulder. "Well, there's plenty to go around, dear, plenty for everyone." She collected their plates and retreated to the kitchen, humming a jaunty, tuneless melody. After breakfast, they ventured out into the fog. The air was cold and damp, carrying the ubiquitous scent of brine and rot. Cobblestones, slick with moisture, made for treacherous footing. The town was already decorated for the festival. Ropes of thick, dark green seaweed were draped over doorways and lampposts. Strange, abstract effigies made of driftwood and bone hung from the eaves of houses, clattering softly in the non-existent wind. "This is incredible," Mark said, snapping a picture of a particularly grotesque carving of a kraken devouring a whale. "The craftsmanship is amazing. It's like a living museum." Sarah was less impressed. She focused on the town's public statues. There were several in the main square, all depicting stern-faced, bearded men in colonial garb. They were the town's founders, and every single one of them had the same flaw. The sculpting was masterful, the details of their clothing and hair perfect, but their eyes were all wrong. They were too wide, too round, carved with a vacant, starring terror that was deeply unsettling. Their mouths were set in grim, determined lines, but their eyes screamed. "Let's split up," Paige suggested, her voice a plea. "I want to see if I can find a hill or something. Maybe I can get a signal from higher ground. I need to check my messages." "Good idea," Mark agreed, consulting his map. "I want to visit the whaling museum. Sarah, you and Leo could check out the shops. We'll all meet in the square for the ceremony at noon." Sarah reluctantly agreed. The thought of being separated in this oppressive fog made her uneasy, but she could not articulate why without sounding paranoid. She watched Paige disappear into the mist, a lone figure walking up a steep, winding lane, her phone held aloft like a desperate torch. Mark headed in the opposite direction, whistling cheerfully. Sarah took Leo's hand. It was cold. "Where do you want to go, sweetie?" she asked. Leo pointed a small finger down a narrow alley between two leaning buildings. That way. I don't think there are any shops down there, she said. My friend wants me to go that way, he insisted, his voice firm. He pulled her along, and with a sigh of resignation, Sarah followed. The alley opened onto a small, secluded cove. A rickety pier extended a short way into the water where a few dinghies were tied up. The centerpiece of the cove was a massive, dry-docked whaling ship, the Sea Witch, its hull bleached and splintered with age. Near it stood a small, dilapidated shack with a sign swinging from a single hinge. The faded letters read, Jedediah Croft, the Scrimshaw Shack. Well, I guess this is a shop, Sarah murmured. The windows were dark with grime and the place looked abandoned, but the door was slightly ajar. Leo, pulling free from her grasp, walked right up to it and pushed it open. A small bell tinkled somewhere inside. The interior of the shack was even darker than the outside. It was one cramped room, smelling of dust, whale oil, and dead things. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with hundreds of pieces of scrimshaw. Whale teeth, bones, and pan bones were covered in impossibly intricate carvings. They depicted brutal whaling scenes, shipwrecks, and terrifying sea monsters that defied biological possibility. But most of the carvings showed the same thing, over and over. A small, defenseless ship being offered up to a colossal, spiral-shaped entity rising from a stormy sea. A figure sat at a small workbench in the back, his form hunched over a piece of bone. He did not look up when they entered. It was Jedediah Croft, the man they had seen briefly on the docks. He was gaunt and pale, with long, greasy gray hair tied back with a leather thong. The only sound was the meticulous scratch, scratch, scratch of his engraving tool on the bone. "Hello," Sarah said, her voice sounding loud in the dusty silence. Jedediah Croft did not respond. He continued his work, his focus absolute. Sarah stepped closer, her curiosity overriding her fear. Leah wandered the shop, his small fingers tracing the carved tentacles and gaping maws on the older pieces. Is this your work?" Sarah asked, gesturing to the shelves. The scratching stopped. Jedediah slowly, deliberately placed his tool on the bench. He turned his head. His eyes were the color of the sea-worn pebbles on the beach, pale, gray, and completely devoid of expression. He looked at her, then his gaze shifted to Leo, and for a moment a flicker of something pity perhaps crossed his face. He gave a single, slow nod. "They're very detailed," she said, struggling for words. "You're very talented." He did not reply. Instead, he raised a bony finger and pointed to the piece on his workbench. It was new, the bone still white and clean except for the fine black lines of his work. Sarah leaned over to see it. Her breath caught in her throat. The scene he was carving was of the town square, shrouded in fog. At its center stood a family of four, a man with glasses and a map, a woman with shoulder-length hair, a teenage girl holding a small rectangle in her hand, and a small boy, his hand in his pocket, clutching a spiral shell. They were surrounded by the smiling, watching faces of the townsfolk, and from the cobblestones at their feet, shadowy, indistinct tendrils were beginning to rise. It was them. The detail was impossible, undeniable. Every feature, every piece of clothing was perfect. Sarah stumbled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "How did you—" Jedediah Croft simply turned back to his workbench, picked up his tool, and began to scratch at the bone once more, adding another tendril that was curling around the leg of the carved woman. Scratch, scratch, scratch. "Leo, we're leaving," Sarah said, her voice tight with panic. She grabbed her son's arm. He did not resist, but his eyes were fixed on a large, ancient whale tooth on a high shelf. It was carved with a single, massive, spiraling eye. She practically dragged him from the shack, bursting back out into the disorienting fog. She stood there, her chest heaving, trying to make sense of what she had seen. It was a prank. It had to be. A sick, elaborate joke they played on tourists. But the detail, the shell in Leo's pocket. Meanwhile, Paige had found her hill. The lane had led her up to the base of the Silent Sparrow Church, which sat on the highest point of the island, overlooking the town and the sea. The fog was thinner here, and she could see the rooftops of Port Blossom spread out below her like a collection of moldering toys. She held her phone up. One bar. It flickered, then vanished. Then it reappeared. "Come on, you piece of junk," she muttered, waving it around. "It will not work." Paige yelped and spun around. A young man, maybe a year or two older than her, was leaning against the stone wall of the church cemetery. He was tall and handsome in a severe, old-fashioned way, with dark, intense eyes and a smile that was both charming and predatory. It was Gideon Pike, the youth leader she had seen on the docks. "You startled me," Paige said, lowering her phone. "My apologies," Gideon said, his voice smooth and educated, a stark contrast to the rougher accents of the other townsfolk. "I was just admiring your persistence. We get a signal up here sometimes when the tide is right, but the town prefers clearer connections." "Yeah, my dad said something about that," Paige said, pocketing her phone in defeat. "So what do you do for fun in this town?" "We have our traditions," Gideon said, pushing himself off the wall and walking closer. "We honor our history. We keep the old ways alive. It gives one a sense of purpose. Something I imagine your world, with its fleeting signals and instant messages, lacks." There was a condescending edge to his tone that irritated her. "My world is fine, thanks." "Is it?" he asked, stopping a few feet from her. His eyes roamed over her face, analytical and cold. "You seem bored, disconnected. Here everyone is connected, to the town, to the sea, to our purpose." "And what purpose is that?" Paige challenged. Gideon's smile widened. "Why, to ensure prosperity, to honor the pact, to feed the great hunger. You'll see it all at the festival. In fact, some of our younger members are preparing for the harbor dash down at the main pier. A traditional game. You should join us. It might be more exciting than hunting for a signal." His invitation felt less like a friendly offer and more like a command. Something about his confidence, his utter certainty, was unnerving. But the alternative was trailing after her parents or sitting alone in the musty inn. "Fine," she said. "Whatever, lead the way." Gideon's smile was triumphant. "Excellent. I think you'll find our games very immersive." He turned and started down the lane, not once looking back to see if she was following. He did not have to. He knew she would. Down at the Whaling Museum, Mark Copeland was lost in the past. The museum was a single, cavernous room filled with the tools and relics of a brutal trade. Harpoons, flensing knives, and giant cast-iron pots for rendering blubber filled the space. The centerpiece was the complete skeleton of a right whale, suspended from the ceiling. It was immense, a cathedral of bone. The curator was Mayor March himself, who had offered Mark a personal tour. The men of Port Blossom were the finest whalers in the world, March said, his voice echoing in the large room. He ran a hand lovingly along the serrated edge of a cutting spade. They were fearless. They had to be. To face a beast like this in a small wooden boat, it takes a certain kind of faith. Faith in what? Mark asked, captivated. Faith in the sea, the mayor replied, his eyes glittering. They understood it as a transactional relationship. The sea gives and the sea takes. You must honor its power. You must give it something of value if you expect to receive its bounty in return. He paused, looking up at the whale skeleton. They learned that lesson the hard way with the Providence. He led Mark to a glass case at the far end of the room. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was a single, ancient logbook. Its pages were yellowed and stained with seawater. It was open to an entry dated October 30th, 1678. The handwriting was spidery and panicked. Captain March's log, the mayor said softly. The final entry before his miracle. Read it. Mark leaned closer. The ink was faded, but the words were still legible. Storm shows no mercy. The mainsail is torn to ribbons, the rudder is splintered. Waves crash over the bow, stealing men into the black water. The beast that has hunted us for 2 days circles the wreckage, its golden eyes like lanterns in the deep. It is not a whale. It is a god of hunger from a lightless place. I have offered it our cargo, our whale oil, our very ship. It is not satisfied. It whispers in my mind what it wants. It wants a living sacrifice, a warm heart, a terrified soul. May God forgive me, but the boy, the cabin boy, is weak with fever. He will not last the night anyway. I have made a pact, his life for ours, his soul for the bounty of the sea. Mark recoiled from the case as if he had been burned. My God, he breathed, that's horrible. Horrible, Mayor March said, his voice losing its folksy charm, becoming flat and hard. No, Mr. Copeland, it was practical. It was a bargain, a promise. And as I said, we are a town that keeps its promises. The mayor's smile was gone. In its place was a look of serene, absolute conviction. He looked past Mark, towards the museum's entrance, as if he heard something. The tolling of a heavy bell began to echo through the fog from the town square. Noon, the ceremony was about to begin. Come, the mayor said, his hand clamping down on Mark's shoulder with surprising force. You must not be late. You and your family are the guests of honor after all. The friendly tour guide had vanished. This was the high priest, and he was leading the offering to the altar. Chapter 3. The Opening Ceremony. Mayor March's hand was a vice on Mark's shoulder. The jovial mask had been discarded, leaving the hard, zealous core of the man exposed. He propelled Mark from the museum's dusty silence out into the fog-choked street. The bell from the silent Sparrow Church was no longer tolling a welcome. It was a slow, methodical dirge. each iron clang landing like a shovelful of dirt on a coffin lid. The sound seemed to come from all directions at once, a disorienting, oppressive beat that settled deep in Mark's bones. A town that keeps its promises, Mark repeated, his voice a dry rasp. He tried to pull away, but the mayor's grip was unyielding. That logbook, that's just folklore, right? A story you tell to spook the tourists. We have no tourists, Mr. Copeland, March said, his voice calm and terribly reasonable. We have guests. We have offerings. History is not a story to us. It is a set of instructions. He steered Mark towards the town square, his pace unhurried. Do not be alarmed. You are part of something much older and grander than your small life. You should be honored. The words were so insane, so utterly detached from reality, that Mark's mind recoiled. This was a performance, an elaborate piece of community theater for their bizarre festival. That had to be it. The man was a fanatic, a history enthusiast who took his role far too seriously. A lifetime of rational thought and historical analysis fought against the cold dread seeping into his gut. There was always a logical explanation. They entered the square. The fog was thickest here, pooling between the leaning buildings and swirling around the base of a large, temporary wooden platform erected in the center. The entire population of Port Blossom, it seemed, was present. They stood in a silent, concentric circle around the platform, their faces pale and serious in the diffused white light. They were not looking at the platform. They were looking at him, at the entrance to the square, waiting for him. As he and the mayor stepped onto the cobblestones, a collective, sighing breath rippled through the crowd. He saw Sarah then, near the fountain, carved like a breaching whale. She was holding Leo's hand in a white-knuckled grip, her eyes wide with a frantic terror that confirmed his own burgeoning fear was not misplaced. She saw him, and her expression crumpled with a desperate relief that was immediately extinguished by the sight of the mayor's hand on his shoulder. "Mark," she cried, rushing towards him and pulling Leo along. "We have to go, now. Something is wrong with this place." Leo did not seem to register the panic. The boy was staring at the platform, his head tilted as if listening to a distant melody. In his free hand, he clutched the iridescent shell from the beach. "Sarah, what happened? Where, Paige?" Mark asked, his own voice tight with a rising panic that threatened to shatter his composure. "I don't know, I can't find her," Sarah said, her words tumbling over one another. "That man in the shop, the carver, he was carving us, Mark. A picture of us right now in the square. He knew we would be here." Before Mark could process this, Mayor March released his shoulder and stepped between them, his arms spread wide in a gesture of benevolent welcome. His public persona was back in place, the folksy smile plastered on his face. "Mrs. Copeland, so glad you could join us," he boomed, his voice echoing unnaturally in the muffled air. "And young Leo, punctual the lot of you. We can begin." The crowd shifted, tightening the circle. Two large men with the same vacant, sea-pebble eyes as Jedediah Croft moved to stand behind them, blocking the alleyway they had entered from. There was no escape. They were enveloped by the town. "Where is our daughter?" Sarah demanded, her voice shaking but fierce. "Paige is being entertained," March said smoothly. "Our young people are showing her the historic grounds down by the pier. She is perfectly safe. Now please, the ceremony waits." The mayor mounted the 2 short steps onto the platform. He turned to face the crowd, a showman taking his stage. "Friends, neighbors, children of the pact," he began, his voice ringing with liturgical fervor. "For 347 years we have gathered. We have honored our sacred promise. The sea has given us bounty. It has given us health. It has given us purpose. And today, as our forefathers did, we give back." A low, guttural chant began to rise from the crowd. It was not composed of words, but of dissonant, open-mouthed tones that mimicked the groaning of a ship's timbers and the roar of a storm. The sound was deeply primordial, unsettling on a level that bypassed conscious thought. "We are graced this year," March continued, his voice rising above the chant, "by guests who have traveled far to share in our renewal, to witness our gratitude, the Copeland family." He gestured to them. Every single head in the crowd turned in perfect synchronicity to face them. Their smiles were back, but they were no longer welcoming. They were hungry, predatory, the expressions of a pack of wolves that has successfully cornered its prey. Mark grabbed Sarah and Leo, pulling them into a tight, protective cluster. His mind was racing, desperately trying to find a way out, an explanation, anything other than the monstrous truth that was solidifying before him. This was not a play. This was real. From the edge of the crowd, the trio of silent weavers emerged. They moved with an unnerving, gliding motion, their feet seemingly not touching the ground. Between them, they carried a massive net. It was woven from a thick, black rope that looked like it was slick with tar, and it was studded with what looked like hooks of bone and bits of rusted metal. They laid the net at the foot of the platform with practiced reverence. "The sea gives and we receive," March intoned. "And so we offer a heart, a vessel for our faith, a beacon for the great maw, a promise of the feast to come." Sheriff Cormac Prynne, his face impassive, stepped forward. He was carrying a large, old-fashioned lobster pot made of weathered wood and rope. He placed it on the platform. A faint, rhythmic pulsing was visible through the slats. From within, a low, wet, squelching sound could be heard. March reached into the pot. When his hand emerged, he was holding the heart of the festival. It was a grotesque object, roughly the size of a human head. It was a tangled mass of dark red seaweed, thick black kelp, and something that looked horribly like raw, butchered meat, all woven around a central, pulsating bladder that visibly inflated and deflated with a slow, sickening rhythm. A thick, briny fluid dripped from it, staining the wooden platform dark brown. "Traditionally," the mayor announced, his eyes locking onto Mark, "our guests of honor are given the privilege of placing the heart into the ceremonial net, a symbol of their union with the town, with our purpose. Mr. Copeland, if you please." He held the dripping, pulsating mass out towards Mark. The chanting from the crowd grew louder, more insistent. The last vestiges of Mark's denial shattered, the logbook, the scrimshaw carving, the mayor's words. It all crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. This was a ritual sacrifice, and they were the intended victims. "No," Mark said, his voice low and shaking. "Get away from us." The mayor's smile did not falter. "I am afraid that is not an option." "Get away!" Sarah screamed, trying to shield Leo with her body. The moment the refusal was uttered, the atmosphere in the square underwent a profound change. The smiles of the townsfolk vanished in an instant, replaced by identical expressions of cold, reptilian fury. The chanting stopped, plunging the square into a dead silence that was more terrifying than the noise had been. The two large men standing behind them took a step forward. Sheriff Prynne placed a heavy hand on his holstered sidearm, not to draw it, but as a simple, final statement of authority. This was the moment Mark knew they were going to die. A surge of pure, primal adrenaline coursed through him. He shoved Sarah and Leo behind him. "Run!" he hissed. But there was nowhere to run. The circle of bodies was a solid wall. And then Leo moved. He broke free from his mother's grasp. He was not panicked or frightened. His face was placid, his eyes glazed over. He walked with a slow, deliberate gait towards the platform, his gaze fixed on the pulsating heart. The crowd parted for him as if on cue. "Leo, no!" Sarah shrieked, lunging after him, but two of the Weaver women caught her arms, their grips like iron bands. Mark lunged too, but the two large men intercepted him, pinning his arms behind his back with brutal efficiency. He struggled, but it was like fighting against statues. "It seems the boy understands," Mayor March said, a genuine, delighted surprise in his voice. "The young are always more attuned to the old ways. He hears the call." Leo stopped at the foot of the platform. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the shimmering, spiral shell. He held it up. The whisper that had been speaking to him in the shell was no longer a whisper. It was a voice in his head, a commanding, resonant presence that filled his entire consciousness. It was a voice of immense age and power, a voice that promised secrets and wonders in exchange for one simple thing: obedience. "Touch it," the voice commanded, its tone gentle, paternal. "Make it ours." Leo reached out his small hand, the one not holding the shell, and placed it gently on the grotesque, pulsing heart. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The moment his skin made contact, the heart gave a violent, convulsive shudder. The low, wet pulsing sound intensified into a deep, resonant hum. It was a sound that did not seem to come from the object itself, but from everywhere at once. The cobblestones beneath their feet vibrated with it. The fog roiled and swirled. And from the direction of the harbor, a low, booming thrum answered, a sound so deep it was felt more than heard, like the heartbeat of a sleeping leviathan. The gilded maw had awakened. It had accepted the opening offering. A wave of collective, orgasmic ecstasy washed over the crowd. They gasped and sighed, some closing their eyes, some tilting their heads back with expressions of rapturous bliss. They swayed in unison to the deep, resonant hum that now filled the air. Mayor March's face was a mask of beatific glory. "It is begun," he whispered, his eyes shining with tears of joy. The men holding Mark and Sarah loosened their grips slightly, lost in their shared trance. In that moment, Mark saw his chance. With a desperate roar, he wrenched one arm free and slammed his elbow into the face of the man on his right. The man grunted and stumbled back, his bliss shattered. Mark grabbed Sarah's arm. "And now," he screamed. He dragged her and a still-dazed Leo away from the platform, shoving his way through the swaying, ecstatic bodies of the townsfolk. For a few seconds, their surprise gave him an opening. They crashed through the first ring of people, their feet slipping on the slick stones. Freedom was a few yards away, the mouth of a foggy alley. Then the spell broke. A furious shout from Mayor March cut through the hum. "Do not let them escape. The offering must not be spoiled." The town turned on them. The ecstatic faces became snarling masks of rage. Hands grabbed at their clothes, their arms, their hair. Mark kicked and punched, fighting with the ferocity of a cornered animal. Sarah stumbled and fell, pulling Leo down with her. A sea of bodies swarmed over them. Mark saw a heavy, calloused hand clamp over Sarah's mouth, saw Sheriff Prynne calmly produce a length of rope. He felt a blunt, heavy impact at the base of his skull. The world exploded in a flash of white, then pinwheeled into darkness. His last conscious thought was of Paige, alone, lost, and being hunted in the fog. Chapter 4: The Harbor Dash. The Harbor Dash was not a race. Paige Copeland understood this fact with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty. It was a hunt, and she was the fox. Gideon Pike had led her down from the church hill to the town's main pier, a long, sprawling structure of thick, creosote-blackened timbers. A group of about a dozen Port Blossom teenagers were waiting for them, their faces all sharing the same placid, inbred curiosity. They looked at Paige not as a person, but as a novelty, a new toy to be played with. "The rules are simple," Gideon had explained, his voice slick with false camaraderie. "We start here at the shore end. The finish line is the last piling at the far end of the pier. The course is not on top but underneath on the crossbeams and supports. First one to touch the far piling wins." He grinned. "It's a test of balance and bravery. The water can get choppy." Paige, full of 16-year-old arrogance and a desperate need to show these small-town weirdos that she was not intimidated, had scoffed. "Looks easy enough." The moment she'd lowered herself through a maintenance hatch in the pier deck, she knew she had made a terrible mistake. The world beneath the pier was a twilight labyrinth of immense, moss-slicked pilings and rotting crossbeams. The fog diffused the light from above into a gray, uniform gloom. The sound of the tolling church bell was a muffled, constant thud, and the only other noise was the slap and suck of the rising tide against the wood. The air was thick with the stench of low tide, dead fish, and something else, something acrid and foul. The race started. The local teens moved with a terrifying, spider-like agility. They scrambled over the beams, their bare feet finding purchase on the slickest of surfaces. They were not competing against each other. They moved as a coordinated pack, flowing around her, ahead of her, behind her, their movements unnaturally silent. They were hemming her in, subtly guiding her deeper into the maze and further from the shore. Paige was clumsy in comparison. Her sneakers slipped on the green slime that covered every surface. She had to move slowly, her hands gripping the rough, splintered wood. The local kids, perched on beams above and around her, watched with detached amusement. They'd whisper to each other in a dialect she could barely understand, then let out sharp, barking laughs that echoed in the enclosed space. "Careful now, city girl," one of them, a lanky boy with weed-like hair, called down. "The tide's coming in. Tends to wash things away." She ignored them, her focus narrowed to the next beam, the next handhold. The water was only a few feet below her now, a churning, opaque gray. She could see dark shapes of kelp swirling in the current. Halfway down the pier, she paused to catch her breath, her back pressed against a massive piling covered in barnacles. That was when she saw the carvings. The piling, like everything else in this town, was covered in intricate designs, but these were not visible from above. They were carved for the eyes of the sea. She saw screaming faces, bodies being dragged down by tentacles, and the same horrifying, spiral-gilled entity from the Scrimshaw shack, its form seeming to writhe in the shifting light. This was not a pier. It was a temple. A giggle from nearby made her jump. One of the girls, younger than the others, was hanging upside down from a beam, her hair brushing the water, her face split by a wide, predatory grin. "You're it," she whispered. Panic began to set in. Paige scrambled onward, desperation making her reckless. She slipped, her foot plunging into the frigid water. The cold was a shock, but the sensation that followed was worse. Something brushed against her submerged leg. It was not kelp. It was leathery and cold, and it wrapped around her ankle with a gentle, exploratory pressure before letting go. She screamed, yanking her foot out of the water. She scrabbled backward on the beam, her heart hammering. Down in the murky water she saw it, a face just below the surface. Its skin was pale and bloated, the color of drowned flesh. Its eyes were milky white and vacant. Long strands of dark hair floated around it like a morbid halo. It was a human face, but utterly devoid of humanity. A tide thrall. Its mouth opened, releasing a stream of silent bubbles. Then another hand, this one skeletal and covered in sharp barnacles, shot out of the water and clamped onto the beam beside her. Paige shrieked and kicked out, connecting with something solid. She scrambled away, moving faster now, adrenaline overriding her fear of falling. The game was over. This was a trap. She looked back towards the shore. The way was blocked. Two of the larger boys, including the lanky one, were perched on the beams, blocking her path, their faces impassive. She looked forward towards the end of the pier. Gideon Pike was there, standing on a wide, stable platform, waiting for her. His smile was gone, replaced by a look of calm, religious focus. He was a shepherd guiding a lamb to the slaughter. The splashing sounds from the water grew more numerous. More of the pale faces were appearing, their dead eyes fixed on her. The things were closing in from below, and the teenagers were closing in from all sides. They were not trying to catch her. They were enjoying the chase. They were savoring her fear. Her terror was part of the game, part of the ritual. She was trapped, halfway to the end of the pier, with monsters in the water and monsters on the beams. The tide was rising, the space between the beams and the water shrinking with every passing minute. "What do you want?" she screamed, her voice cracking. Gideon's voice floated back to her, calm and clear over the sound of the water. "The gilded maw is hungry. It is always hungry. We are taught to be good hosts." A tide thrall began to pull itself from the water onto a low-slung beam between Paige and Freedom. Its movements were jerky, unnatural. Its body was a horror of bloated flesh, clinging seaweed and parasitic sea life. Its jaw hung open, and a low, waterlogged moan escaped its throat. Paige was sobbing now, frozen in place. This was it. This was how she died in this stinking, dark place, fed to monsters by a pack of teenage cultists. Hey! The voice was a harsh, guttural roar from above. It cut through the gloom like a knife. A trapdoor Page hadn't noticed before slammed open in the pier deck above, and a brilliant, focused beam of light from a powerful lantern cut through the darkness, illuminating the scene in stark, terrifying detail. The tide thrall hissed and recoiled from the light, its pale skin sizzling as if burned. The local teens, their faces contorted in snarls of frustration, scurried back into the deeper shadows. A large, hulking silhouette filled the opening. "Get away from her, you godless whelps!" the man roared. A heavy rope ladder tumbled down, its end splashing into the water a few feet from Page. "Get up here, now!" It was the harbor master, Phineas Hale. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through Page. She scrambled over the last few beams, her hands raw and bleeding, and grabbed the ladder. She climbed, her muscles screaming in protest. Below her, the tide thrall hissed and swiped at her dangling feet with a webbed hand. Finn Hale grabbed the collar of her jacket and hauled her the last few feet onto the solid planks of the pier. She collapsed in a shivering, sobbing heap, the salt and slime and terror of the underworld clinging to her. Finn kicked the trapdoor shut and threw the heavy iron bolt. He stood over her, a giant of a man, his face a gnarled mask of fury, his one good eye burning with a cold fire. The other eye was a milky, scarred ruin. "You weren't meant to run the dash today," he growled, his voice a low rumble of gravel and sea salt. He scanned the edges of the pier, his hand resting on the hilt of a large filleting knife tucked into his belt. "The feast has already been chosen." He looked down at her, and for the first time she saw something other than anger in his face. It was a profound, soul-deep weariness. But they get impatient. The young ones, they like to play with their food. He reached down and pulled her to her feet. His grip was rough but not unkind. He pushed a heavy, rust-stained object into her trembling hand. It was a fish-gutting knife, its blade wickedly curved, its wooden handle worn smooth with use. "Take this," he said. "It won't stop them, not if they truly want you, but it might make them pause." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Listen to me. Stay out of the shadows. The darkest corners belong to them. Stay away from the water's edge. The thralls are strongest there. And no matter what happens, no matter who tells you to go, do not let them take you to the lighthouse. That's where they finish it. That's the altar." He gave her a small, forceful shove in the direction of the town. The bell was still tolling its rhythmic, dreadful beat, but now it was joined by shouting from the direction of the square. "Your family is in the thick of it now," Finn said, his face grim. "They've started the ceremony. Go, find them. Maybe it's not too late for you to get out of this, though I doubt it." He turned his back on her then, facing out to sea, a lone, defiant guardian on the edge of a cursed town. Paige stood there for a second, clutching the cold, heavy knife. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a burning, white-hot rage. They had tried to kill her. They had her family. She ran. Her wet sneakers slapped against the pier planks as she sprinted towards the town square, towards the sounds of the ceremony. The hunt was not over, but now the fox had teeth. Chapter 5: A Gathering of Beasts. Rage is a powerful fuel. It burned away the shivering cold in Paige's limbs and sharpened the fuzzy edges of her terror into a needle-fine point of focus. She sprinted from the pier, the fish-gutting knife a cold, alien weight in her hand. The town was no longer a quaint, historical village. It was a hunting ground, and every fog-shrouded window was a predator's eye, every dark doorway a waiting mouth. The sounds of the ceremony had died down, replaced by a low, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the street. It was the same deep vibration she had felt through the timbers of the pier, a sound that made her teeth ache and the air feel thick and heavy in her lungs. The town was breathing. She reached the edge of the square. It was deserted. A thick, wet mist coiled over the cobblestones. The wooden platform was empty, stained with the dark, briny fluid that had dripped from the grotesque heart. A large, dark-colored net lay discarded at its base. The scene was one of quiet, post-ritual solemnity, like a church after a service or an abattoir after a slaughter. "Mom, Dad." Her voice was a ragged whisper, instantly swallowed by the fog. There was no answer. She saw scuff marks on the slick stones, the signs of a struggle. Near the fountain, something lay on the ground. It was her father's folded tourist map, its corners now soaked and pulpy. They had been here. They had fought. And they had been taken. Panic tried to claw its way back up her throat, but she choked it down. Finn Hale's words echoed in her mind. Find them. He had not said save them. He had said find them. It was a small distinction, but it was enough to keep her moving. She clutched the knife tighter. Where would they take prisoners? The church? The museum? Her eyes scanned the surrounding buildings, looking for any sign of activity. A light flickered in a window on the second floor of a building whose sign identified it as the Port Blossom Municipal Office and Lockup. The sheriff's office. Keeping low, she crept along the wall of the square, using a series of large, empty fish barrels for cover. The hum was louder here, vibrating up through the soles of her sneakers. She peered around the edge of the last barrel. The door to the sheriff's office was a heavy slab of dark, iron-banded wood. Standing beside it, as still as one of the town's terrifying statues, was Jedediah Croft, the Scrimshaw carver. He was not looking at the door. He was staring directly at her hiding spot, his pale, pebble-gray eyes seeming to pierce the fog and the shadows. He knew she was there. He raised one long, bony finger and pointed, not at her but at the lockup door. It was an invitation, a confirmation, a dare. Paige's blood ran cold. This was another game. They knew she was free. They were letting her see the cage, letting her feel the sliver of hope before they slammed the final door. A heavy, measured footstep sounded behind her. She spun around, the knife held out in a trembling, clumsy grip. Sheriff Cormac Prynne emerged from the mist. He was not hurrying. His face was a placid mask, his movements deliberate. He held a thick length of rope coiled in one hand. He looked at the knife in her hand, and his lips curled into a thin, contemptuous smile. "The harbor master's blade," he said, his voice a low, unimpressed drawl. "Finn always did have a soft spot for the ones that squirm. He mistakes it for a fighting spirit. He is a romantic." "Where are they?" Paige demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. "Safe," the sheriff answered. "Waiting. The ceremony has begun, but it is not complete. The gilded maw requires a certain presentation. A united offering is more potent. He took a slow step forward. Your family is calling for you. They want you to be with them for the final part. Stay back, she warned, brandishing the knife. It felt flimsy, a child's toy. Put the knife down, girl, Prince said, his voice hardening. You are a part of the story. You cannot change the ending. Jedediah has already carved it. From the corner of her eye, she saw the scrimshaw artist still standing by the door, watching, his face a blank canvas. This was a pincer movement. They were closing in. She feinted to her left, towards the alley. Prin moved with a speed that belied his lazy demeanor, cutting off her path. He uncoiled the rope. I have tied this knot 100 times, he said conversationally. On boats, on nets, on festival decorations, on unruly livestock. It does not slip. Paige did the only thing she could. She screamed and lunged, not at Prin, but past him towards the lock-up door. If her family was in there, she had to get to them. Her charge was clumsy, fueled by blind desperation. The sheriff did not even sidestep. He simply let her pass, and with a flick of his wrist, he sent the rope snaking through the air. The loop settled over her shoulders, and he pulled it tight, pinning her arms to her sides. Her momentum carried her forward, and she crashed hard onto the cobblestones, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs and the knife from her hand. It skittered across the stones, coming to a rest near Jedediah Croft's worn boots. Prin hauled her to her feet, the rough rope biting into her skin. She struggled, kicking and twisting, but he was immensely strong. He dragged her towards the door of the lockup. Jedediah Croft bent down, his joints cracking audibly, and picked up the gutting knife. He held it for a moment, examining the blade in the gray light, before slipping it into a sheath on his own belt. He then produced a large, iron key and unlocked the heavy door. See, Sheriff Prince said, his voice calm and steady in her ear. It was all meant to be. Now you can be with your family. He shoved her through the doorway, into a darkness that smelled of damp stone, salt, and despair. The heavy door slammed shut behind her, the bolt thudding home with a sound of absolute finality. She was plunged into near-total blackness, the last of her rage and hope extinguished, leaving only the cold, crushing weight of utter failure. A moment later, a weak, trembling voice cut through the gloom. Paige. It was her father. A single, grime-caked window high on the opposite wall let in a sliver of the fog-diffused light, just enough to reveal the shape of their prison. It was a single, large cell. The walls were made of massive, salt-bleached stones that wept with a constant, cold condensation. The floor was packed dirt, and the only furniture was a low wooden bench. In the far corner, huddled together, were her family. Mark was sitting up, his face pale, a dark, matted patch of blood in his hair above his ear. Sarah was on her knees, her arms wrapped around a silent, still Leo. They were all looking at her, their faces etched with a horror that mirrored her own. I'm sorry, Paige choked out, the words tasting like ash. I tried to get away. It's not your fault, Mark said, his voice hoarse. He struggled to his feet and stumbled towards her, pulling her into a desperate hug. It's mine. This is all my fault. Sarah joined them, her embrace fierce and protective, and for a moment they were just a family again, clinging to each other in the darkness. But one member of their circle was missing. Leo stood apart, his back against the cold stone wall. He had not moved. He was still holding the shell, his thumb stroking its iridescent surface. "Leo," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "Baby, are you okay?" Leo looked up. His eyes in the dim light seemed darker than they should, like deep pools of water. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "He's coming," Leo whispered, his voice sounding distant, ancient. "The tide is rising. He's coming to the lighthouse for his dinner." He lifted the shell to his ear, closing his eyes, a look of peaceful bliss on his face. He was listening to his new friend, and from somewhere outside, through the thick stone walls, they could hear the slow, rhythmic lapping of the tide, a relentless, watery clock counting down the last hours of their lives. Chapter 6: The Salt-Cured Cell. The hours that followed were a slow, agonizing crawl towards dawn. The cell was a cold, damp purgatory. Water wept constantly from the stone walls, the droplets tracing erratic paths through centuries of salt rime and pale green mold. The air was heavy, saturated with the smell of the sea and the faint, underlying stench of decay, as if the very foundations of the building were built upon a bed of rotting fish. There was no sound from the town, only the incessant, maddeningly patient shush and retreat of the tide against the building's outer wall. Mark paced the length of the small cell, his steps agitated. The blow to his head had left him with a throbbing ache and a profound, disorienting clarity. The rational historian was gone, replaced by a cornered animal. His life had been a series of logical progressions, of cause and effect, of well-documented facts. This place, this situation, defied all logic. It was a monstrous, impossible truth, and he had led his family directly into its gaping maw. "There has to be a way out," he muttered, running his hands over the thick iron bars of the cell door. They were cold, immovable, set deep into the stone. He examined the lock. It was a huge, archaic mechanism that could have held back a charging bull. The window. He dragged the heavy wooden bench beneath the high, narrow opening. He climbed onto it, his hands slipping on the damp wood. He could just reach the window. The glass was thick and distorted, caked with a century of grime. Outside, there was only the swirling, featureless gray of the fog. Iron bars, thinner than those on the door but just as strong, were set into the stone on the other side of the glass. He pushed against them, his muscles straining, but they did not budge. He slumped back down, defeated. "It's no use," he said, his voice hollow. "They built this place to last." Sarah sat on the dirt floor, her arms wrapped around her legs. Her initial panic had subsided, leaving behind a cold, hard knot of fury. She watched her husband's futile attempts with a grim patience. She was not thinking of escape. She was thinking of the knife Paige had lost. She was thinking of the smug, placid face of Sheriff Prynne. She was calculating the distance to his throat, the force required to inflict a mortal wound. Her mind, usually occupied with color palettes and font choices, was now a machine of brutal, vengeful mathematics. Paige sat beside her, her knees drawn up to her chest. She had recounted her story of the harbor dash in a low, flat monotone. She told them about Gideon Pike, the spidery teenagers, the pale faces in the water, and she told them what Finn Hale had said. "The lighthouse," she repeated, her gaze fixed on her father. He said that's where they finish it, that's the altar. The word hung in the damp air, grotesque and obscene. Mark stopped packing. He looked from his daughter to his wife, then to his son, who remained a silent, isolated figure in the corner. "Then we don't let them take us there," Mark said, a new, harder edge to his voice. "We fight them here, in this cell. We don't make it easy for them." It was a desperate, hopeless plan, and they all knew it. "What about Leo?" Sarah whispered, her eyes pleading with her husband. "Look at him, he's not right." They both looked at their son. Leo had not spoken another word since his cryptic announcement. He sat on the floor, cross-legged, the shell held in his lap with both hands. His breathing was slow and even, his expression serene. He seemed completely untouched by the terror that consumed the rest of them. He was not their prisoner. He was a guest in a waiting room. "The shell," Paige said, her voice barely audible. "It started when he found that shell." Mark walked over to his son. He knelt down, his movements slow as if approaching a wild animal. "Leo," he said gently, "Champ, can you hear me?" Leo's eyes opened. They focused on his father's face, but there was no recognition in them, no flicker of the boy he had been. It was like looking at a stranger who happened to be wearing his son's face. "Can you give me the shell, Leo?" Mark asked, holding out his hand. "I want to look at it." Leo's fingers tightened around the object. A low hum, the same resonant frequency that permeated the town, seemed to emanate from the shell, or perhaps from Leo himself. "No," Leo said, his voice flat. "It's a gift. My friend gave it to me." "Your friend is not real, Leo," Mark said, his voice strained with desperation. "It's a trick. This whole town is a trick." "He is more real than you," Leo replied, his words possessing a chilling, adult certainty. "He is ancient, he is hungry, and he is very, very pleased with our gift." His eyes flickered towards his family. "He says a whole family is a rare delicacy. The fear tastes so much sweeter when it is shared." Sarah let out a choked sob. Mark recoiled as if he had been struck. This was not their son's imagination. This was a possession. The thing in the water, the gilded maw, was speaking through him. Before anyone could react, the heavy thud of the bolt being drawn back on the outer door echoed into the cell. A moment later, a key scraped in their cell lock. The door creaked open. Mayor Obadiah March stood there, framed by the darkness of the corridor. He was holding a lit kerosene lantern, the warm light casting long, dancing shadows on the damp stone. He was smiling, a look of paternal disappointment on his face. Behind him stood Sheriff Prynne, his hand resting on his hip. "Such a commotion," the mayor said, his voice soft and chiding. "I had hoped you would use this time for quiet contemplation, to prepare yourselves for the great honor you are about to receive." "Stay away from us, you monster," Sarah snarled, getting to her feet. The mayor's smile tightened. "Monster, my dear woman, I am a shepherd. I tend my flock. I keep my town prosperous and safe just as my great-great-grandfather did. I uphold the sacred pact that has sustained us for generations." He stepped into the cell, the lantern light making his eyes gleam. "You are not victims. You are a sacrament, the spark of your unified life, the delicious, potent terror of a family facing oblivion together. It is the finest meal we can offer our benefactor." It ensures another year of calm seas and full nets. He saw Leo then sitting peacefully in the corner, his eyes widened in genuine appreciation. "Ah," he said, nodding slowly. "And the boy, he has received the call, he understands. This is a very good omen. A sacrifice that walks willingly to the altar is a blessing indeed." Mark moved to stand between the mayor and his family. "You will not touch them." Sheriff Prynne took a step forward, but March held up a hand to stop him. "There is no need for violence. Not yet. The tide has turned. It is time. The entire town is waiting for you at the lighthouse." He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze lingering on their terrified faces like a connoisseur appreciating a fine wine. "The procession will begin shortly," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Do not fight. It only makes the fear sharper. And while that is a desirable outcome for the maw, it can be so undignified for you." He turned and stepped out of the cell. Prynne followed, his cold eyes giving them one last dismissive glance. The door slammed shut. The key turned in the lock. The bolt slid home. They were left in the oppressive silence once more, but now it was different. It was the silence of the final moments. The lapping of the water outside seemed louder, more insistent. The high tide was coming. Mark looked at his wife, at his daughter. He saw their fear, their defiance, their despair. He knew that their last stand would not be in this cell. It would be on the path to the lighthouse, or in the shadow of the crooked stone tower itself. He did not know how, but he would not let them be led like lambs to the altar. He would make the shepherd bleed. Chapter 7. The Procession of the Damned. There was no clock in the cell, but they felt the passage of time in the subtle shifts of the world around them. The gray light filtering through the high window began to fade, signaling the slow death of the afternoon. The incessant lapping of the tide grew louder, closer, until it sounded as if the waves were breaking directly against the outer wall of their cell. The hum, the low, resonant frequency of the awakened maw, intensified, becoming a constant physical pressure against their bodies. It was a vibration that seemed to loosen the teeth in their jaws and turn the fluid in their inner ears to lead. Hope was a currency they no longer possessed. In its place was a grim, solidified resolve. Mark had torn a long, thick splinter of wood from the underside of the bench. It was a clumsy, pathetic weapon, but it was something. Sarah had found a loose, fist-sized stone in the packed dirt floor. Paige, her fury having burned down to cold, hard embers, had unlaced her sturdy hiking boot, ready to swing it by the laces like a flail. They were a pathetic little army, armed with sticks and stones, preparing to face a legion. The sound of the bolt being thrown was like the crack of a starting pistol. They scrambled to their feet, forming a tight, defensive triangle, their backs to Leo, who remained seated, oblivious and serene. The cell door swung open. Mayor March and Sheriff Prynne stood there as before, but this time they were not alone. Flanking them were four hulking men with the dead, sea-pebble eyes of true believers. They were whalers by birth, their bodies thick with the muscle of hauling nets and rowing against storms. They carried no weapons. They did not need them. "It is time," the mayor announced, his voice devoid of all its previous theatricality. It was flat, the voice of a man conducting a routine, necessary task. "We're not going anywhere," Mark growled, brandishing his wooden splinter. The sheriff let out a short, humorless laugh. "Don't be a fool." The four men moved into the cell. They did not rush. They moved with the slow, inexorable confidence of the tide. Mark lunged, jabbing his splinter at the closest man's face. The man barely flinched, turning his head so the wood scraped harmlessly along his cheek. He then brought a massive, calloused hand up and clamped it around Mark's throat, lifting him from his feet as if he were a child. Mark's breath was cut off, his struggles useless. Sarah screamed and threw her rock. It struck another of the men in the temple with a dull thud. He grunted, annoyed, and backhanded her. She crumpled to the floor. Paige swung her boot, catching a third man on the shoulder. He absorbed the blow and simply grabbed the boot, yanking her off her feet. Within seconds, it was over. They were subdued, their pathetic weapons scattered on the dirt floor. The men dragged them from the cell, their grips like iron manacles. They were not gentle. Mark's feet scraped against the stone, and Paige's arm was twisted to a painful angle. They were hauled into a short corridor and up a flight of stone steps, emerging into the back room of the sheriff's office. And then they saw him, Leo. He was not being dragged. He was walking calmly beside Mayor March, his hand holding the iridescent shell. He looked at his struggling family, his face showing no emotion, no flicker of recognition. "Leo, please," Sarah cried, her voice raw. "Help us." Leo turned his head. "The gilded maw does not like its meal to be bruised," he said, his voice the calm, alien monotone he had adopted. "Be still. The honor is spoiled by struggle." The mayor patted the boy's head. "The child speaks the truth. Cease this pointless resistance. Accept your purpose." They were forced out the front door of the lockup and into the town square. The entire population of Port Blossom was waiting for them. The fog had begun to recede as the tide came in, and in the eerie twilight they could see every face clearly. They stood in two neat, silent lines, forming a corridor that stretched from the square down the main street, towards the sea. They held unlit torches made of driftwood wrapped in oil-soaked rags. As the Copelands were forced into the aisle, a low, rhythmic chanting began, the same wordless, guttural sound from the ceremony. It was the sound of a promise being fulfilled. Their procession began. They were marched down the center of the human corridor. The faces that watched them pass were a gallery of horrors. They saw Beatrice Stowe, the sweet innkeeper, her face contorted in a mask of religious ecstasy. They saw the weavers, their hands clasped, their heads bowed. They saw Jedediah Croft, who met Mark's gaze with his empty, pebble-gray eyes and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, as if to say, "See, just as I carved it." They saw Gideon Pike standing with the other teenagers. He caught Paige's eye and gave her a slow, mocking smile. He raised his hand and mouthed the words, "You're it." The procession was a slow, humiliating death march. The chanting grew louder, the deep hum from the sea more intense. They were being paraded through the town they had chosen for their vacation, a town that was now their tomb. They were no longer the Copeland family. They were a living sacrifice, a public spectacle, a meal being presented to a god. They reached the end of the main street, where the road began to slope down towards a rocky, windswept point of land. At the very edge of the point, Silhouetted against the roiling, gray sea stood the lighthouse. It was even more unsettling up close. The stone was dark and slick with sea slime, and the tower did indeed lean, as if perpetually bowing to the power of the ocean. It was not a beacon of hope. It was a crooked, jagged tooth in the mouth of the world. The light at the top was not lit. The path to the lighthouse was lined with the town's children, all holding small, flickering candles in glass jars. They watched the Copelands pass with wide, serious eyes, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames. They were being taught. This was their catechism. This was how they learned to keep the promise. At the base of the lighthouse was a heavy, iron-bound door. A figure stood waiting before it. It was Phineas Hale, the harbor master. His face was a grim, stony mask. He held a lit torch, its flame whipping in the wind. As the procession approached, he stepped forward, blocking the door. Mayor March stopped. The four men holding the Copelands halted. The chanting of the crowd faltered. "Finn," the mayor said, his voice tight with displeasure, "step aside. The hour is upon us." "No," Finn Hale said, his voice a low growl that carried over the wind. "This ends. It has been 300 years. It is enough." The mayor's face darkened with fury. "You dare, you who are bound by the same blood, the same pact. You would break the promise and doom us all." "We are already doomed," Finn retorted. He looked at the Copelands, his one good eye filled with a terrible, weary pity. "We have been doomed since the first boy was given to the sea." He raised his torch higher. "I will not let you feed it any more." "You are one man," Sheriff Prynne scoffed, stepping forward. "You cannot stop us." "I am not trying to stop you," Finn said, his gaze shifting to the sea behind the lighthouse. "I am trying to stop it." A look of dawning horror crossed the mayor's face. "The light! What have you done to the light?" "The lens is filled with my own whale oil," Finn roared. "The purest grade. When I light it, it will burn hotter than it has in a century. It will not be a call. It will be a fire bright enough to blind a god." It was a desperate, suicidal gambit. To focus that much heat and light into the deep might anger the maw, drive it away, or it might simply enrage it beyond all measure. "Seize him!" March screamed, his composure finally shattering. But before the whalers could move, Finn Hale did something unexpected. He tossed his lit torch not at the mayor but onto the ground at the feet of the Copelands. A pre-laid line of whale oil, invisible on the dark, wet ground, instantly ignited. A wall of fire, chest-high and roaring, erupted between the Copelands and their captors. The four whalers roared in pain and surprise, letting go of their prisoners as they stumbled back from the intense heat. In that single, chaotic moment, the Copelands were free. "The door," Finn bellowed over the roar of the flames. "It is not locked. Go up the tower. It is your only chance." He turned his back on them and charged, not at the mayor or the sheriff, but into the crowd of stunned townsfolk, a wild, one-eyed beast swinging a gaffing hook he had hidden behind his back. He was not trying to win. He was buying them seconds. Mark did not hesitate. He grabbed Sarah's hand, shoved Paige towards the lighthouse door, and scooped up the still passive Leo. They scrambled through the fire-lit darkness. the heat of the flames scorching their backs, the enraged screams of the cultists ringing in their ears. Paige reached the iron-bound door and pulled. It was heavy, but as Finn had promised, it was unlocked. It swung inward with a low groan, revealing a spiral staircase of stone, disappearing up into the crushing darkness of the tower. They tumbled inside, Mark slamming the heavy door shut just as the first of the townsfolk broke through the wall of fire. The last thing they saw before the door sealed them in darkness was Finn Hale, overwhelmed by a sea of bodies, still fighting, a doomed, defiant titan. The door had no lock on the inside. They could hear the townsfolk pounding on the outside, the wood groaning under the assault. "Up!" Mark yelled, his voice echoing in the enclosed space. "Go up the stairs." They began to climb, stumbling in the pitch black, their hands scraping against the cold, damp stone of the curved wall. They were trapped in a stone tube, climbing towards a light that promised not salvation, but a final, terrible confrontation with a hungry god. Below them, the sound of splintering wood told them the door would not hold for long. Chapter 8: The Eye of the Maw. The climb was a blind, vertical nightmare. The stone steps were worn and uneven, slick with a perpetual, salty dampness. The only sounds were their own ragged breaths, the frantic scrape of their hands against the curved wall, and the relentless, booming crashes from below as the townsfolk threw their weight against the iron-bound door. Each impact vibrated up the entire structure of the tower. Mark led the way, practically carrying Leo, who remained limp and unresisting in his arms, the shell still clutched to his chest. Paige was next, her hand gripping the back of her father's jacket. Sarah brought up the rear, her ears straining for the sound of the door giving way. The darkness was absolute, a physical presence that pressed in on them, stealing their breath and sense of direction. The tower seemed to go on forever, a spiraling, stone gullet leading them higher and higher into the sky. After what felt like an eternity, Mark saw a faint line of gray light above them. It was a hatch in the ceiling, the lantern room. Almost there, he gasped, his lungs burning. He reached the top of the stairs, a small stone landing, and pushed against the heavy wooden hatch. It swung open with a rusty shriek, flooding the stairwell with the dim, eerie light of the dying day. He scrambled through the opening, pulling Leo up after him. The lantern room was a circular chamber encased in a cage of thick, storm-proof glass and brass. At its center stood the source of the light, a colossal Fresnel lens, a beautiful beehive-like structure of concentric glass rings and prisms designed to focus a single flame into a beam that could cut through miles of open sea. The air was thick with the smell of whale oil. Finn Hale had done his work. The main reservoir at the base of the lens was filled to the brim with the clear, viscous liquid. A large, unlit wick, as thick as Mark's arm, sat in the center. They all clambered into the room, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. Through the glass, they had a panoramic 360-degree view of the world. They could see the entire island of Port Blossom laid out below them, a collection of dark, silent houses huddled in the gloom. They could see the crowd of townsfolk swarming around the base of the tower like angry ants. And they could see the sea. It was no longer gray. The tide was at its peak, and the water for 100 yards around the point had turned a deep blood red. It was the bloom, the crimson tide the stories had mentioned, a sign that the entity was close. As they watched, the water began to churn, not with the motion of waves but with a slow, deliberate rotational pull, as if a colossal drain had been opened on the seafloor. A final, splintering crash from below signaled the end of the door. A roar of triumph echoed up the stairwell. They were coming. "The light," Sarah said, her voice a strained whisper. "We have to light it." Mark looked around frantically. There had to be matches, a striker, something. He saw a small metal box on a shelf near the lens mechanism. He lunged for it, his fingers fumbling with the rusty clasp. It was full of long, wooden matches. He struck one. The phosphorus tip flared to life, a tiny, defiant spark in the face of the encroaching apocalypse. He reached towards the thick, oil-soaked wick. "Don't," a calm voice said. He froze. The voice had come from Leo. His son was standing now, his back to the great lens. He was no longer holding the shell. He had placed it carefully on the floor at the very center of the room. The iridescent object seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light, and the deep humming that filled the air now seemed to be emanating directly from it. Leo's eyes were open wide. The pupils had dilated, consuming the irises, leaving two pools of pure, fathomless black. The voice that came from his mouth was not his own. It was a layered, resonant chorus of whispers, ancient and sibilant. "The offering has come to the altar. The fire is not for you to light." The tower gave a violent shudder, not from the people climbing it, but from a tremor deep in the bedrock beneath them. The churning of the sea grew more frantic. The red water began to rise, not as a wave, but as a swelling, unnatural bulge. And from the center of that bulge, something emerged. It was not a beast of tentacles and teeth. It was a form that defied geometry, a shimmering, golden lattice of impossible angles that partially existed in their dimension. It was a living equation of light and shadow, the gilded maw, and its sheer presence was a violation of sanity. As it rose, the water cascaded off its formless form, and the air crackled with a palpable, psychic pressure that made their noses bleed. The townsfolk below had stopped their ascent. They were gathered on the rocks, their faces turned upward, their mouths open in ecstatic, silent worship as their god revealed itself. The gilded maw had no face, no eyes, but they all felt its gaze, a cold, cosmic attention that stripped away their identities and reduced them to their component parts: meat, bone, and a flickering spark of terrified consciousness. "You have been chosen," the voice of Leo intoned as the entity rose higher. "Your fear is a sacrament, your unity a feast. Give it to me." The entity's center, a vortex of perfect, light-devouring darkness, began to align with the lantern room. This was how it fed. It did not need to touch them. It would simply consume them, their light, their life. The match in Mark's hand burned down to his fingertips. He dropped it with a yelp of pain. He looked at his wife, her face a mask of defiant terror. He looked at Paige, who was staring at the monster with a strange, numb acceptance. He looked at the thing that was wearing his son's body. This was the end, the story Jedediah had carved. There was no escape. But as the maw's vortex began to darken the room, as the very glass of the lantern cage began to groan under the impossible pressure, a flicker of movement caught Sarah's eye. It was Paige. She was not looking at the maw. She was looking at the shell on the floor, the source of the hum, the anchor that connected the entity to her brother. With a final, desperate scream of pure maternal rage, Sarah lunged. Not at Leo, not at the maw, but at the shell. She scooped up the fist-sized rock she had carried from the cell, a weapon she had forgotten she still held. No, the chorus of voices shrieked from Leo's mouth. Sarah brought the rock down with all her strength. The impact was not a crack, but a sound like 1,000 panes of glass shattering at once. The iridescent shell exploded into a cloud of glittering black dust. The effect was cataclysmic. The hum stopped. The psychic pressure vanished. Leo collapsed to the floor in a heap, the blackness receding from his eyes, leaving the familiar, frightened gaze of a 9-year-old boy. And the gilded maw, its anchor to this plane severed, its connection to its vessel broken, let out a silent, psychic scream that shattered every window in the lantern room. The golden lattice began to flicker and glitch, its impossible form collapsing in on itself. The dark vortex at its center pulsed violently, no longer consuming but disgorging. A wave of pure, chaotic energy erupted from it. Mark, acting on pure instinct, tackled his family, shoving them down behind the heavy brass base of the lens just as the wave hit. The world dissolved into white light, and the sound of a universe being torn apart. When consciousness returned, it was to silence, a profound, absolute silence. Mark pushed himself up. He was alive. His family was alive, bruised and bleeding, but alive. The lantern room was a ruin. The glass cage was gone, shattered into a million pieces. The great lens was cracked and blackened. The top of the tower had been sheared off. He crawled to the edge. The gilded maw was gone. The sea was calm, its color returning to a normal, murky gray. On the rocks below, the townsfolk lay scattered like broken dolls, their bodies twisted and still. The psychic backlash from their god's violent departure had annihilated them in an instant. The procession of the damned had met its end. Mark looked down at his family. Sarah was holding a crying, terrified Leo. Paige was staring at her hands, then at the sky, a look of disbelief on her face. They had survived. They were alone on a cursed, silent island with no way off. They were wounded, traumatized, and irrevocably broken. But they were alive. As the first, clean rays of a true dawn broke over the horizon, illuminating the wreckage of the town and the calm, indifferent sea, Mark Copeland understood. They had not won. They had simply been spat out. The gilded maw was not dead. It was ancient and patient. And the sea is deep. It would wait. And it would remember the taste of a family's fear. The story was over. For now. The end.